The fashion industry has operated like the Wild West for decades and decades now, and finally, we're getting some much needed regulation to help propel the industry towards sustainability and make some much needed changes. However, as a fashion brand owner, I appreciate that it can be really overwhelming and really daunting trying to figure out how you're going to comply with all these different regulations. And so in this episode, I'm going to talk about how you can prepare and ensure you future-proof your brand. It is such an exciting time to be in the fashion sustainability space because we are finally getting some love and attention from the regulation community. And I think it's about time. It's so long overdue because up until now, companies were pretty much just expected to do good things out of the goodness of their hearts. And I think we all know that for-profit companies will only do things that add to their bottom line because that's what they're set up to do. That's what happens in a capitalistic society. And so this regulation is so needed because we cannot continue to expect companies to do things out of the goodness of their hearts. We need to actually make them take action. And I think unfortunately it's gotten to a breaking point in the industry where there's so much harm being done that it cannot be ignored anymore. And yeah, it's kind of unfortunate that it's taken this breaking point for us to finally get some attention of regulators, but it is exciting that it's finally happening. And I know as a fashion brand owner, it can be really overwhelming to try to navigate everything. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can do. But before we do that, I know that you might feel frustrated. I know you might feel overwhelmed. I want us to look at this as a perspective of us all being a team. We are all in this together. We are all trying to transform the harmful fashion industry. That is everyone's objective and purpose at the end of the day. So while it's frustrating for you as a brand owner, I would also encourage you just to have some empathy and compassion for the folks trying to put this together. Because as you know, the fashion industry has been unregulated for decades and decades now. And so now to start to add in rules to a game that has already been going on, like it's hard to do that, especially because we can't just pause clothing production. We can't just stop buying and selling clothes. Like that's just not going to happen. So we very much need to fly the plane while we're building it. And that's just kind of the messiness that we need to approach right now. And the other thing I want you to be aware of as well, which is kind of a concern I have / it's a challenge that's being addressed, is the fact that the fashion industry is a global industry, right? Much like any other industry is, because you as a brand owner could operate in one country, but then you can sell in another, but you can produce in another country, and then you sell to people all over the world. And legislation historically is just for one state or one province or one country. It's not a piece of legislation that is encompassing of every country and every state and every city. So because of that, there might be some overlap. There might be some contradictory legislation. And so we will just have to navigate that all together when it comes. So just have that empathy and compassion. Like people are trying their best. They're not trying to do this to make your life difficult. We're all trying to do this to improve the fashion industry. I wanted to give you some background quickly, just in case you don't really know what's going on and you're new to this. Over half a decade ago, the European Union, or the EUs, were the pioneers in this space. They decided to finally sit down and put some laws in place because it was just so overdue. However, they wanted to approach this very intentionally and systematically, so they gathered stakeholders from brands, from nonprofits, from factories, from mills, like just everyone in the fashion supply chain, as well as consultants, change makers, nonprofits, and they were really, really intentional about hearing about everyone's perspective and opinions because they really wanted to make sure these regulations would do more good than harm. And so they've been brainstorming and they've been roundtabling for the past half decade, and finally they've distilled it into some proposals. And we're going to talk about that today. And so the EU has definitely been the pioneer in this, and they've been thinking about this and being intentional about this for a while now. And then in the US, they are also putting together a lot of different bills and regulations. However, the US has had less time to kind of sit and ponder. They definitely came to this a little bit later, which is fine. But it's just helpful, I think, to know this context because as you're seeing a lot of bills being passed in the US, you might feel like some of it's conflicting, and maybe some of it's because they're just trying to pass it through. And then on the flip side, you might be thinking, well, why has it taken them so long to do anything in the EU? And that's because they're trying to be really intentional about it. But this problem is so big and there's so many things wrong with the industry. And this is a game we've been playing, right? This is a game and all of a sudden we're now trying to make rules about the game. So I think you can appreciate that it's difficult. And so just having that context is really helpful. So for you as a brand, there's really like 5 things I think you need to do. So take note of where you are, where you want to go, the regulations that apply to you, and what the delta is, like what the gap is. And last but not least, just make an action plan and make sure that it's going to be completed on time so that you can adhere to the regulations. It's really that simple. Figure out where you are, where you want to go, what regulations are applicable to you, make a note of what the gap is, the delta is, and then make a plan. I know it is easier said than done though, so let's dive a little bit deeper into every single point and how you can address it. And I know me sitting here telling you that is really simplifying it, but I want you not to be overwhelmed and stick your head in the sand and avoid this, because this is going to come into effect whether you like it or not. And so it's important to be proactive versus reactive, and to really further encourage you to act. I am doing complimentary consultations to give back to the industry. We can jump on a call, talk about where you're at, where you need to go, what regulations would be applicable to you, and help put together that action plan for you. So I'm doing this free of charge just because I want to help and I don't want anyone to be sticking their head in the sand and having any excuses. So you can visit recloseted.com/consultation to book a time slot. But now let's dive in deeper into every single one. So I would love you to listen to this podcast episode and then come to the consultation having done everything so that we can be as productive as possible. But the first step, like I mentioned, is to classify where you are. And so I've made up this quadrant. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm going to make a bit of a demonstration so you can see it visually. And if you're listening to this, then I would recommend you go to youtube.com, search up Recloseted Radio, and you'll be able to see this episode. But basically, think of a quadrant. So we're going to have an x-axis and we're going to have a y-axis, okay? And so on the x-axis, we're going to really be measuring how big your brand is from a revenue perspective. And so if we picture the quadrant in our heads, we're going to have the x-axis, which is how big your company is, and then the y-axis, which is your sustainability efforts. And so in the bottom left, we're going to have small businesses that aren't really doing a lot when it comes to sustainability. And then directly above that, in the top left, we're going to have small businesses that are doing a lot when it comes to sustainability. If we shift over to the right, in the top right, we're going to have companies that are making a lot of money, bigger businesses that are also doing a lot when it comes to sustainability. And then if we shift down into the bottom right, we're going to have companies that are making a lot of bucks, but not doing a lot when it comes to sustainability. So map out where you are right now. Are you a small business that's doing a lot? Are you a small business that isn't doing a lot? Are you a big business that's doing a lot? Or a big business that isn't doing a lot? So figure out where you are in the quadrant. That's step 1. Now, step 2 is to look into the future. Where do you see your brand in the next 2 to 5 years? Do you foresee your brand growing a lot in terms of sales? So are you going to move on the x-axis? Are you going to become a big business? Additionally, when it comes to a sustainability perspective, what do you foresee yourself wanting to do? Are you going to move up on the y-axis? And hopefully the answer to both is yes, right? Like you want to be increasing your revenue. You want to be increasing what you're doing in the world. So hopefully the answer is yes. I feel like I'm going to move in the next 2 to 5 years. And so the reason why it's important to forward look is because a lot of this legislation currently is applicable to bigger businesses. And so if you're a smaller business, like if you're a startup right now, I would not stress too much about it, but I think it is important to be proactive and keep tabs on everything so that you can really ensure that you're building your business in a way that will adhere to everything. But it is important to know where you're going. So know where you are, know where you're going, steps 1 and 2. And then step 3 is to figure out what regulations are going to be applicable to you. So right now, I would mainly think through where you're operating. So where is your business legally located / where do you reside? Next, I would think through where you're manufacturing. So where does all your production happen? And then last but not least, who is buying your clothing? Is it mainly Americans, Canadians, Australians, Europeans? Who is buying your clothing? And likely the last piece could be more global, right? Because nowadays with e-com, like people can place orders all over the world. List out all the countries, all the states, all the provinces that you touch, and that's your answer. Those are the countries that you need to pay attention to when it comes to their regulation and legislation. And I'm going to give you a few legislation pieces that I feel like will touch majority of our listeners so that you can keep an eye on it if you haven't already. So there's a few things that have passed already and a few things that are in the process of passing. So I'm going to tell you both so that you can keep an eye on both. I'm going to start with the states because there's a little bit less to keep track of there. So with the states, there has been one bill that was passed, which is called the California SB 253 or 253. It really requires businesses with more than 41 billion in annual revenue operating in California to report scope 1 to scope 3 emissions. So this has been adopted already. It's in effect. And so if you aren't a brand that is making more than $41 billion in annual revenue, then you're going to be okay. But as you work up towards that, you'll want to make sure you keep in mind this bill so that you can be proactive and you can adhere to it and not have to frantically freak out. So that's the first one that's been passed. And then there's two that are exciting that are coming down the pipeline that I want you to be aware of. So the first one is the New York Sustainability and Social Accountability Act, or the New York Fashion Act for short, that you may have heard of. So this is going to be quite comprehensive, which is exciting. It's going to require supply chain transparency. It's going to require ESG disclosures and due diligence for apparel companies conducting business in New York with annual global revenue of 100 million plus. So if you are currently at 100 million plus, then this is something you for sure need to be keeping tabs on. Or even if you're hovering around that mark and you're about to get there, this is something you really want to be proactive versus reactive about. The third one that is also being proposed right now when going through the process is the Fashion Accountability and Building Real Institutional Change Act, or the Fabric Act. This is meant to protect U.S. garment workers by improving working conditions, reforming pay scales, and investing in domestic production. So if you currently produce in the US, this is 100% something you want to keep an eye on and make sure you are staying up to date on. Those are just a few in the US, and I know there's talks and movements of others, but those are the main ones. And so if you are producing in the US or you operate in the US or you sell to the US, then you'll want to know and keep tabs on these bills. And so now the European Union, or the EU. So the EU, like I mentioned, has done a lot of work. They've been working on this for half a decade or more. So they have a lot of regulations that is exciting. And so it's under this umbrella term, which is called the EU Strategy for Sustainable and Circular Textiles. So all of this kind of falls under that strategy. And this was born because they needed a way to implement the commitments of the European Green Deal and the Circular Economy Action Plan to reinvent the entire life cycle of textile and footwear products. It is super visionary and super needed as well, but like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the fashion industry is a big clunky machine. So in order to change it, it needs to be done very intentionally and strategically. And so there are four main categories under this strategy right now that I wanted to bring to your attention. There are other things being worked on, such as microplastics and things like that, but that is still just in the infancy stages. So to really not overwhelm you, I wanted to bring up the ones that are more concrete and have a little bit more progress. So the first category is under product design. So the Ecodesign for Sustainable Products Regulation, or ESPR, is meant to help set minimum design standards for all products sold within the EU. And this will detail requirements around recyclability, durability, reusability, repairability, and use of hazardous substances. So this is huge because before you could kind of just do whatever you wanted as a fashion brand. And so now it's going to be a lot more stringent. And beyond that, the use of digital product passports that will collect and share this information with consumers are expected to become required by law, which is great because if you think about it right now, you can walk into a mall and one store will have a tag with information and another store will have another tag, and it's not really standardized and you don't really know if it actually is sustainable or if it actually is green. So all this information now is going to be in this digital product passport that you can scan on your phone. And so that will be great from a consumer shopping perspective, but then also from a brand perspective, like I mentioned, it is going to be more regulated around what you can put in clothing, which is great because we regulate what's being put in our food and in our body. And yes, I know we don't ingest our clothing. However, The skin is the largest organ in the body, and so we wear our clothing for hours and hours, so this is actually really, really exciting. The first category, again, is the product design one, and then the second one is the marketing piece. So the EU Green Claims Directive is something I'm personally really excited about because we're finally cracking down on greenwashing. So if a brand is going to say anything related to sustainability, they need the claims to be specific, backed by evidence, verified by independent bodies, and communicated clearly. France has taken a really large step in this regard, and they have already pressured larger companies to put carbon labels on all clothing sold in the country. And so this is something that's proposed and being worked on, which is going to be huge because we can't continue to have brands roguely saying that they're sustainable or green. It's just so unfair to the brands that are actually doing the work. So we're cracking down on that. And then in the UK, this is going to be called the Green Claims Code, and it's also aimed to combat greenwashing. So from a marketing perspective, that's what's being done. And then from a waste management perspective, there's a lot too. The Waste Framework Directive already exists, but they're calling for an addition, which is going to be called the Extended Producer Responsibility, which actually already exists in France. The French are just killing it, but essentially it's going to require all companies to finance and essentially take responsibility of the collection, the sorting, and the recycling of their own textile waste, which is huge because before brands could just do whatever. They could just dump it, they could do whatever without any repercussions. So we're finally asking brands to take accountability and responsibility of their waste, which should have been what was done at the beginning. But we're finally getting to it now. So that's the extended producer responsibility. It's proposed. And then also on top of that, the other thing that's really exciting is you've likely seen a lot of news articles of brands just burning clothing or throwing clothing away when they can't sell it. And this will be especially the case with luxury brands because they don't want to erode their premium brand equity. So they will just burn unsold inventory because they'd rather do that than put it on sale. And so they're finally cracking down on that potentially as well. So the destruction of unsold goods will now be limited/banned. And this is something that's proposed and in the works, but if this comes into fruition, this is going to be great as well. And then last but not least, reporting. So reporting and data has always been something that the fashion industry struggles with. And even with a lot of the corporate, environmental, social, and governance ESG reporting, a lot of companies still struggle to secure sufficient data and performance metrics or define economic activities that can actually be considered sustainable. There's just a lot of comparity across brands. Like sometimes they're comparing apples to oranges or oranges to pears, and then that makes it really hard for consumers to figure out which brands they want to support because people are saying different things. And then also from an investor perspective too, like it can be hard because you're comparing apples to pears and pears to oranges. So it's really difficult. And so there's going to be a standardization of this, and this is going to be called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD. And this is going to require companies to report on ESG activities via a standardized framework. And so it's going to mandate environmental and human rights diligence and action plans across the value chain. And this is already in effect and it's been adopted, which is great. And so this is just high level 4 of the different categories under this EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles. But know that there's other things that are being talked about, such as microplastics and other things as well. But these are the things that are in the more adult stages, you would say, and have been getting a lot of momentum. And I wanted to just tell you about it if you aren't already aware of it. And so these are some of the things you want to start to consider. And then based on what these laws are proposing, you need to take a good hard look at your business and think about what the gap is and where you want it to go. And so you can start to list out, like, what do we need to do to start to meet these criteria and close the gap. And so this is really, really important to make that plan and that strategy. And it can be hard to do that without knowing the situation you are right now, which is why I'm doing the complimentary consultation. So I'm doing it for this month only. So make sure you take advantage of it. Go to recloseted.com/consultation. And I really look forward to diving into this with you. Before you do the consultation, I would love you to think through where you're at right now, where you want to go, which regulations you think would be applicable to you / ones you're most worried about potentially, and then some ideas for some action items you can take, and just bring that with me, think it through, and then we can discuss it. And before we close off, I just wanted to remind you again that we all have the same mission. We're all here to transform the harmful fashion industry. So even though we're building the plane while we're flying it, it will be okay. Everything's going to be a little bit messy because we're already playing this game that we're now trying to regulate. So just go into this with the right expectations, do your best, be genuine, be intentional about it, and it will all work out.